Buenos dias. My name is Kris Gutierrez. I'm at the University of California, Berkeley. And my title today is Supporting Dual Language Learners. Yo hablo más than English. So what I want to talk to you about today is really underscored by the title I chose for my talk. And that is that dual language learners have a much more expansive repertoire than we often give them credit for, right? They have rich language experiences and rich social cultural experiences that we could leverage in educational settings. But instead, what often happens is that the dual language learner comes to school with a suitcase filled with tools and experiences. But when they reach the classroom door, they're not allowed to bring in that suitcase, that maleta that's filled with experiences that they could be leveraged in meaningful kinds of learning experiences. And friends, this is the beginning of how inequality gets structured in schools for dual language learners. And so what I'd like to talk about today briefly is some of the powerful ways in which inequality gets structured for dual language learners. One of the first and most common ways is that we tend to homogenize who English learners are. And yet they're among the most diverse student populations. Some of them have been in this country for many years. Most of them have been born in this country, and some of them have arrived more recently. Some of them speak English fluently, others depend on the home language, and others, just like my title shows, mix languages not because they don't know, but because that's the way we use language to make meaning. A second way in which we continue to structure inequality is that we conflate two important goals. We conflate the important goal of learning English. And by the way, I've never yet met a parent of a dual language learner who says, I don't want my kid to learn English, right? But we continue to conflate the important goal of learning English with what we know about how people learn, and that is that I must and should use my full linguistic repertoire to make sense and make meaning. But we tend to confuse and conflate those two in policy and practice. And that leads us to the pernicious and overarching practice of failing to leverage the tools and expertise, the everyday knowledge that we know must be leveraged for people to learn. So for the past 20 years or so, I've been studying English learners. And more importantly, I've been designing learning environments where all youth can be smart. And one of the many things that I've learned from that experience is that when you design learning environments that really not only value, but make available a whole range of tools, forms of assistance, work and joint activity with others, and leverage that full linguistic toolkit, that youth will start to develop powerful forms of literacy, the kinds of literacy that can be valued both in the academy and beyond, right? So I want to just introduce you to several ways that we can start countering the way inequality is structured. And I'm going to give you a metaphor for thinking about what we've learned about how people learn, what we know about the role of culture and learning, that tells us that there's more variability within groups, right, than across groups. And this is certainly the case for English learners, but yet we continue to create policies and practices with this monolithic lens in mind. So I ask you, friends, to develop a binocular vision in which you understand the needs of the cohort, like English learners, and understand their needs deeply. But that's insufficient for developing curriculum, for developing policies and practices, that you need a second move. You need to understand the variability in that group. Failure to do so leads to one-size-fits-all practices in which dual language learners are neither learning, but you are continuing to preserve the practices of unequal education for this important population. So in the environments in which I've designed, we find that when you start to think differently about the English learners, saturate the environment with tools and new practices, that some really interesting things happen. Not only do these youth produce more extravagant and significant and much more powerful forms of literacy, but something counterintuitive happens. When these youth are in classrooms in which they're forced to learn English, they're constrained and don't produce very sophisticated kinds of texts. But in these environments, something counterintuitive happens. When they're environments in which the home language and English are unmarked, by that I mean they're both normalized, and they can leverage them, these dual language learners who are not very familiar with English actually start to experiment more with English in these settings than they do in the classroom. So I want to quickly introduce you to Juan. Juan is a second grader who's learning to develop what we call academic English. In this environment, he can draw on Spanish and English and all the meaningful experiences that make up his life. And we've given him tools to be able to do that. And I want you to notice how Juan begins to experiment with language, to stretch against his own level of competence.
Hi, this is my baby brother, Diego. He's 3 years old. I want to start my storytelling by beginning when he was born. When he was born, he was premature. His brain didn't fully develop. He was the size as my mom's hand. The doctor gave him some medicine so he could move a lot and not get sick. Now he goes to therapy so he could walk, play, and eat. He's big now, and he can move a lot. I love my baby brother.
So Juan's case is not an anomaly. Students who get to engage in practices like this not only start to develop more complex texts and use language in more sophisticated ways, but they also start to see themselves as different kinds of learners. And Juan was very proud of his video. When I saw him after he did this, I said, Juan, I really like your video. And he says, I know, everybody loves my video. Right? Well, this is a really important lesson for us, one that we've really begun to leverage in settings, not just with K through 5 children, but with youth in high school, learning what it means to engage in environments where meaning-making is privileged. When you leverage the full repertoire that youth begin to engage in practices that are valued not only in the academy and beyond. This is not just a pedagogical issue. This is an equity issue. This is a very important 21st century issue. Thank you.